Okay, so we've been digging into some really compelling intelligence lately. It suggests something pretty historic, actually. A shift in global power dynamics that's been, well, almost completely missed by mainstream reports.
That's right. What we're seeing points to an entire continent, 1.5 billion people,
Yeah,
potentially becoming the trade equal of, well, one of the biggest economies on the planet.
yeah, almost like forming a new kind of global superpower bloc. It sounds like sci-fi, but the sources suggest it's real, and definitely not something getting much airtime. So our mission today is really to unpack these claims. Reports that China is dropping like 100% of tariffs on a huge list of African imports. And Beijing is apparently saying this applies to all African countries, but under this emerging One Africa government framework.
Right.
This sounds like more than just a trade deal. It feels like a fundamental reshaping.
It absolutely does. And the intel suggests it's already rolling out. And the scale here is just, well, it's staggering. You have to think about what it means. African businesses, manufacturers, entrepreneurs, suddenly getting access to China's, $18+ trillion economy.
Wow.
And, crucially, on the exact same terms as domestic Chinese suppliers.
The same terms.
Exactly. So it's not just, a bit better access. It's parity. It's unprecedented. It really signals a strategic recognition of Africa as this unified economic force.
So the big question is, what does this really mean for businesses in Africa, for global trade patterns, for, I guess, the future of international power itself? We're diving deep into some really fascinating intel here, reportedly coming from insiders, people apparently close to discussions of both the AU headquarters and Chinese diplomatic missions. This is a deep dive. So, okay, let's unpack the core of this then. This 100% tariff-free deal from China for African imports. What really jumps out is that it's supposedly happening now, as of this month.
Yeah, that's key. It's not a promise for the future. It's boots on the ground, implementation stage. And the practical effects, well, they're enormous. African businesses can just ship goods to China. No import tax.
Just zero tax.
Zero tax. Think about that. For a manufacturer, an entrepreneur, you're directly plugging into that massive market. And apparently they're setting up new AU-China platforms to help register and facilitate this. The analogy one source used was quite striking, actually. They said, if you're in One Africa, you're now trading into China as if you were based in Shanghai.
Wow. Okay, that's a powerful way to put it.
It really is, and it covers so much: agriculture, textiles, minerals, food processing, light manufacturing. You could see, almost instant profit jumps in those sectors across the continent.
We saw a quote from a source identified as Protocol Black, reportedly close to AU talks. He said, "You're not just selling to China anymore. You are China's trade equal." Some are even calling it the biggest economic liberation move for Africa since independence.
That's a huge claim, but you can see the logic behind it given the potential scale.
So if this access is so unprecedented, what's the engine behind it?
Yeah.
Our sources suggest it wasn't like normal AU diplomacy that got this done.
No.
It was facilitated through this framework insiders are calling the One Africa government structure. Now, this structure, it's not officially like a formal government yet, right?
Not formally, no. But it's reportedly being treated behind the scenes as the sort of de facto voice, the real negotiating authority for African policy in these critical foreign talks.
Interesting. So it's like an unofficial power center that's actually getting things done.
Exactly. And the phasing is interesting, too. According to someone described as a key strategist, Chairman Shadow, this structure was sort of activated in phases starting early 2024.
Okay.
And this massive tariff deal with China, it's apparently one of its first big flagship missions.
Right.
And China's reported stance kind of clarifies it. They apparently told AU diplomats something like, look, we supported you during liberation. We support you now as one.
As one.
We're not negotiating with 55 separate countries anymore. We're talking to one Africa.
That's a fundamental shift in approach.
Absolutely. It recognizes and maybe even encourages that unity.
And there's this idea that this isn't just out of the blue, that this deal is the harvest of seeds planted decades ago. Going back to China's relationship with Africa during the liberation wars in the 60s and 70s.
Yes, and that history is often overlooked, but it's very specific. China actively trained freedom fighters. We're talking Zimbabwe, Mozambique, Angola, Guinea-Bissau, Tanzania, South Africa. The list goes on.
Right.
You had Chinese advisors on the ground supporting anti-colonial forces, often against Western-backed regimes. They supplied weapons, sure, but also medical aid, a revolutionary doctrine. There's this powerful contrast someone drew where others colonized, China equipped, where others took, China trained.
That really frames it differently.
It does. And now the narrative is that this loyalty is coming full circle. China is essentially saying, we helped you stand up back then. Now let's walk together as equal partners.
Okay, so let's get into the nitty-gritty. How does this deal actually work? There was a breakdown apparently leaked to SBN, that news agency focused on AU affairs. It said 98% of tariff lines on African goods slashed to zero.
98%. That's practically everything.
Now, usually, these full tariff eliminations, they're for least developed countries, LDCs, right? The UN-recognized ones.
Correct. Special status.
But what's groundbreaking here, according to the reports, is China isn't just applying this to individual LDCs in Africa. They're applying it to the entire One Africa bloc, regardless of each country's specific LDC status.
Exactly. And that's huge. It bypasses those usual classifications.
So what does that mean for the actual, logistics on the ground?
Well, it involves practical things like new customs fast lane corridors being set up between key African ports and Chinese shipping networks, streamlining the physical movement of goods. And the AU has reportedly already sent trade officers to Beijing to help coordinate, regional compliance and standards.
So they're actively building the infrastructure for it.
Yes. And the core message on the trade side is simplicity. No duties, no quotas, no red tape, at least on that tariff front.
Wow.
Of course, businesses still need to handle standards, certifications, shipping. International trade is complex. But those fundamental financial barriers, the tariffs and quotas, reportedly gone, making it so much easier to just enter the Chinese market.
Which brings us to the global tremors. Because a deal this big doesn't just affect Africa and China, right?
Yeah.
It potentially reshapes the whole global trade system. And we're hearing reports of, anxiety, even panic in the West.
Yes, the reported Western response is quite telling. You have companies apparently lobbying the WTO, questioning the legality, the fairness of such a, exclusive and sweeping deal. Is it compatible with existing trade rules?
Right, the formal channels.
And then diplomatically, Western governments are reportedly ramping up efforts, pushing African leaders to reassert their individual national sovereignty.
Trying to pull them back from this One Africa idea.
Seems like it.
Yeah.
Likely fearing they'll lose their traditional influence if Africa acts as a single bloc with China. And the talk of emergency G7 sessions on Africa consolidation, that really highlights the level of concern.
It sounds like they see it as a genuine strategic threat.
Well, behind closed doors, some analysts are reportedly saying, quite bluntly, if Africa and China genuinely act as one, the West might not be able to stop them. Economically, diplomatically. Some are even floating this term, a dual-core superpower.
Dual core.
Yeah, where one Africa and China move together, like a symbiotic bloc. Think about the combination. Manufacturing powerhouse in China, raw materials in Africa, a massive youth labor force in Africa.
Global logistics networks.
Shared voting blocs at the UN, alignment within BRICS. It's a potent mix.
There was that quote from General Umoja, identified as an AU security advisor, saying this isn't just the global South rising, but, in his words, the new world boss.
That's incredibly bold language. The new world boss. It signals a huge shift in perceived power.
It really does. So looking ahead then, what are the expected outcomes? We'd obviously expect a surge in African exports to China.
Definitely.
And reports mention new AU-China economic zones possibly popping up in cities like Lusaka, Nairobi, Lagos.
Integrated zones.
And maybe Chinese firms shifting more production into Africa.
Yeah.
To leverage this access and bypass other global issues.
That's a strong possibility. Plus, easier access for African citizens themselves. The idea is they'll soon access China's consumer platforms, investment platforms, maybe straight from AU trade apps.
Wow, okay, so it connects people directly too.
Right.
What about the immediate challenges or maybe opportunities for young entrepreneurs in Africa specifically, given this new access?
That's where it gets really exciting, I think, because the narrative is very much focused on the youth. This isn't just seen as some abstract policy win. It's framed as a movement that belongs to young Africans. Okay. Think about it. The girl in Kampala designing fabrics.
Yeah.
The kid in Gaborone fixing phones. The coder in Kigali. The content creator in Soweto. The dreamer in Khartoum.
Right.
The idea is, for the first time, they won't be locked behind these invisible economic barriers, border politics, visa struggles. They can potentially export their art, their code, their designs, their ideas directly.
Directly into that huge Chinese market.
Exactly. So, a Zambian farmer selling mangoes in Beijing becomes feasible. A Nigerian fashion house could potentially scale overnight using Chinese digital platforms like their online malls. A Malawian app developer, maybe pushing tools directly into the WeChat ecosystem. It's described as youth-driven globalization, African version, real bottom-up potential.
And it seems it's not just about selling things. There's talk about infrastructure development changing too,
Well,
moving away from the debt trap narrative we often hear,
yes.
towards something being called equity blueprints. What does that actually mean?
Well, the reports mention a new clause being discussed. For Chinese firms operating under this new pact, an obligation apparently to transfer technology, train local workers, and actually build value chains inside Africa, not just extract resources.
So embedding the benefits locally.
Precisely.
Right.
Which leads to this idea of intentional, dignified development.
Dignified development.
Yeah. So new roads in Kenya. The goal isn't just to connect mines to ports, it's to connect makers to markets. New ports in Senegal. Not just for shipping oil out, but for exporting locally developed innovation.
Right.
The stated plan is, don't just extract, expand together. And that feels different. If true, it's aligning infrastructure and trade with dignity.
Yeah.
Trying to avoid the ghost highways or white elephant stadiums of the past, making sure it serves local economies long term.
So pulling all these threads together, it really paints a picture of a profound shift. You have China, who reportedly supported Africa during liberation struggles, now reportedly giving the continent unfiltered access to its massive market. And the key catalyst seems to be this idea. All it took was one Africa.
It captures the core idea perfectly. When you act as 55 separate nations, you negotiate, you bargain. But when you act as one unified bloc, you command, you set terms. History really could be shifting right now. The West is clearly watching, maybe nervously, and you can imagine the buzz on the streets, Harar, Lusaka, Nairobi, Addis Ababa. Because if this plays out, one Africa and China together really do form a new kind of superpower.
And what that means practically.
It means African farmers potentially exporting without begging for quotas. African factories producing without facing huge tariff walls. African youth innovating with a direct line into the world's largest consumer market.
It really reframes the whole relationship. It's not just trade figures, is it? It's about, dignity, as you said, positioning, global presence.
Exactly. For so long, the narrative was Africa as just a supplier of raw materials, often talked about, not talked to.
Right.
But now, if you have this one Africa structure effectively steering diplomacy, and China treating the continent as a genuine partner, not a pawn, it suggests a totally new era.
An era where decisions aren't just made about Africa in rooms Africa isn't in.
Yes. Where Africa is at the table, setting the agenda, where the handshake feels genuinely equal.
It implies a new identity almost.
It does. For 1.5 billion people, a potential new identity. Powerful, unified, respected. This isn't just another trade agreement story. It feels like a continent declaring, okay, we have arrived.
So as you think about everything we've discussed today, maybe consider this. How might this declaration of arrival, if that's what it is, by an entire continent, how might that fundamentally reframe not just economics, but our cultural and political understanding of the world for decades